Hello, my name is Fiona Imbali from ACTS, and today I am privileged to have a panel discussion with climate change experts from Nairobi and the University of Sussex. And our discussion today is going to be about climate relevant innovation system builders. This is a mechanism that was developed by top scholars from the University of Sussex in collaboration with scholars from the Africa Sustainability Hub located within ACTS to try and help policymakers and researchers in East Africa and Africa generally to enable them access funds globally on climate financing. To have this discussion, on my left is Dr. Rob Byrne from the University of Sussex. He's one of the top scholars who developed the CRIBS mechanism. Welcome, Dr. Rob. And to my immediate right is Dr. Joanes Atela. He is a top scholar on climate change, and he is the head of climate resilient economies at ACTS, and also one of the scholars that developed the CRIBS mechanism. Welcome, Dr. Joanes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could start with Dr. Rob, the Climate Relevant Innovation System Builders CRIBS mechanism was developed to try and enhance the engagement processes on climate change, to enable scholars and policymakers and researchers in Africa to gain insights on how to develop proposals that can be fundable by the GCF. Dr. Rob, you are one of the scholars that developed the CRIBS mechanism to enable policymakers in East Africa and more so Africa to access funds globally on climate change. What was the idea behind the formulation of the CRIBS mechanism?
Well, research we've done with ACTS and other colleagues at Sussex, David Ockwell in particular, and looking at the success of technologies in developing countries, and actually looking at failures as well, and recognizing that it's not simply the technology that if you get the price right, you get the finance, then everything works. That actually there's a much broader set of issues to deal with, which if you consider them all together, looks like a system, which we would call an innovation system. And we realized that perhaps one of the ways to kind of strengthen the kinds of projects that would come out of GCF funding, that would be made possible by GCF funding, we need to do more than simply install technologies. We need to build these broader systems, and that's where the very long-winded name of Climate Relevant Innovation System Builders comes from. So we don't think that anybody else is really trying to put this idea together in a practical way to help policymakers and many other stakeholders, particularly in African countries, to actually achieve this, to actually build those innovation systems which will, we hope at least, make the technology projects that will come through GCF funding much more successful, much more sustainable.
Thank you very much. Dr. Joanes, perhaps you could tell us a bit about the processes towards the development of the mechanism, and why is CRIBS such an innovative mechanism for the scholars on climate change and policymakers to use to access funds at the GCF?
Thank you, Fiona. CRIBS, as Rob has explained, CRIBS is one of the currently incoming innovative approaches to help our African countries and of course the wider many other countries in the developing world to be able to develop competitive proposals. I say competitive proposals in this case because I think if you look at the previous climate change financing mechanisms under CDM, one of the main challenges that African countries faced, and especially not just African countries but other developing countries as well, was the ability to put in place or submit competitive proposals which then would be able to meet donor expectations and be able to really attract funding. Proposals which can speak to the real issues, proposals which can show that they can really be able to address the issues of climate change that Africa and other developing countries are facing. So the CRIBS idea comes in at a timely moment when we just enacted the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement is anchored on this idea around transformational approach to climate action. And when I talk about transformational approach to climate action, it is an approach that enables capabilities within developing countries to be able to participate quite actively in the process. So one of the ways that we are trying to contribute to supporting African countries to meet that particular expectation is, through building or bringing up such tools like CRIBS that would be able to sort of enable African policymakers and other stakeholders interested in climate change financing mechanisms and other initiatives, that they can be able to use this approach to develop very competitive proposals. They can be able to see what are the real problems that need to be solved, and how best can they solve those problems in very innovative way. And just to add, I think the uniqueness about CRIBS in this situation is the fact that it goes beyond the norm, okay, and tries to bring what we call the business unusual perspective, where we are looking at the transformations needed to be able to solve the problems, the climate change problems, in a transformative way. And we think that trying to make these tools as practical as possible, trying to engage with the key people who are expected to carry the mandate of climate change within the developing the country context, as we've done in this particular training, we think is the best way basically to ensure that we achieve that particular competitiveness. And we hope that through that the process, as we continue to make these tools available and usable by these stakeholders, it would be transformative. It would help to change the nature of proposals that the GCF board or other funding mechanisms will be seeing from African countries. So they'll be much more competitive, they'll be stronger, they'll be having that transformative value, which I think has been lacking historically in the climate change financing.
Just to follow up on some of the assertions you've mentioned here. Well, CRIBS is definitely an innovative mechanism for engaging on climate financing globally. Previously, the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, that was meant to actually enable countries to get the global financing on climate change was not very effective. Stakeholders have spoken about Africa only getting 2%, while countries like China getting over 50%. So there was something lacking in terms of skills for policymakers in Africa, and that's why CRIBS was developed. Perhaps you could tell us, we've had a 2 weeks workshop for policymakers in East Africa from Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania and Ethiopia. What skills are these, and what processes does CRIBS incorporate in these engagements to ensure that it is not business as usual that was with the CDM compared to the GCF?
Yeah, I think the experience we've had in the last 2 weeks are what I would call transformational in a way. They are transformational in the sense that we've seen participants from, the different East African countries. And when they came and we started this process, they were having, the normal ideas around writing proposals to the GCF and putting, in place, documentations that, they would then expect the GCF to fund. But looking at those ideas and trying to evaluate them in the context of some of the GCF expectations, some of them would basically be what we call dead on arrival. I mean, they would not be even looked at twice. And this is the tragedy which has been there even in the last climate change era under the Kyoto Protocol. And we basically, as I've said in my initial remark, that we basically cannot stay in that path. We have to improve and be transformational. So this engagement that we've had under through the CRIBS approach, I think has been very transformational, and we've seen that the participants and the policymakers who are participating in the process are already, beginning to be initiated into transformative thinking. When they are thinking about their proposals, they are thinking about the uniqueness of those proposals. what is different from what has been done, what is different from the norm. And through the CRIBS process, they are now able to clearly articulate some of the interventions that can work well or work effectively or in a sustainable way within the African context. And also in the process, I think through the training, they've been able to learn some of the ways of putting in place the strategies. I mean, how do they present the strategies for addressing climate change issues within those proposals? Because sometimes you realize that people, policymakers in Africa, you realize that they have really very useful ideas. They know what is to be done and what needs to be done, and if you attend some of these forums, you'll realize that they can explain this quite very well, and they really know where the problem is. But sometimes to put that in the context of a project, a program, to develop programs out of that, or projects that can really attract funding, is a problem. But we've seen them now developing from not just knowing the ideas that are appropriate, but also being able to frame those ideas in writing, so that anybody who reads those ideas, wherever, in whichever part of the world, the GCF board, at the UNFCCC, they're able to see the transformativeness in the process. So through the CRIBS process, the idea is to plant that transformative thinking, the transformative drive within the participants. The other thing I want to mention is that through the process, the CRIBS is not just is not just an approach to helping enhance capabilities, but it's also a process that is helping in lesson learning. And I think through the 2 weeks training, there has been a lot of learning, both among the participants. They've been able to learn what is happening in different countries. They've been able to learn on some of the innovative ideas that are useful. But not only for the participants, but even for us as experts, we've been able to learn really what is the situation within the country contexts. What is it that is really relevant in Uganda, in Kenya, or in Tanzania, all these countries which were represented here. And I think for us that is very critical in terms of providing a useful training or capacity building, which is kind of aligned to the circumstances of these countries. And that is very important for the next steps in this work.
CRIBS has 4 roles that it seeks to achieve throughout these processes. Could you briefly elaborate what the goals and the roles of CRIBS are?
If I can remember all 4, yes. Essentially it's about building these systems. So there are what we think 4 aspects to that, or 4 ways of doing that. A large part of this is about experimenting, trying things out and learning from those things. So the best way perhaps to learn a lot of useful lessons is to have a diversity of experiments. So promoting diverse experimentation is one of the goals. But of course, you can experiment on your own and learn things on your own, but that's no use to anybody else. So there's also the importance of networks, and again, diversity. So the networks of actors who are connected with what you do, who can learn from what you do. So building diverse networks of a variety of stakeholders is one of the goals. And then the learning, of course, is hugely important. But learning is not only important to those who are involved directly, but it's also important that learning is shared. So we want to promote the kind of public availability of that learning. And we need to work together in what we might call the same direction. So we need to have a shared vision of what we're working towards. So another one of the goals is to build shared visions. So getting that network of stakeholders together, talking through the possibilities, experimenting with various technologies or ideas or practices, and it's sort of evolving, helping that process can help to evolve a shared vision of where we're going and why we're going there, and so on and so on. So that we can really explore all of what Joanes was just talking about the transformative possibilities, finding those and developing those and achieving those. So those 4 goals then are meant to be sort of pursued together in as much as possible in every step of the way that the CRIBS process is meant to try and facilitate.
You speak passionately about networks and collaborations. Perhaps, do you think this is one of the biggest mistakes or one of the biggest misdoings of previous mechanisms that have tried to ensure that policymakers and governments are able to access the fundings? Because one of the participants in the 2 weeks workshop talked about a lot of Africans working in a silo, working alone and thinking that perhaps I will be able to achieve much by working alone. Do you think networks and collaborations is quite key in this process?
Yes, I do, and I think the silo issue is not just a problem for Africans, as I think it was George was saying earlier on. I think that's a problem for everyone around the world. But to build in institutions that allow some kind of communication across those silos is important. So that creating spaces for that. Experiments are good places to do that. So you think of doing a project. Technology projects are always quite complicated things. There's a lot involved in that. So if you recognize that and bring together stakeholders who have expertise in different aspects of a technology, of a place in which that technology is being implemented, local knowledge, etc., etc. You bring all of that together, trying to make a project work. In a way, you are kind of forced to break down those sort of silos or break down the barriers and communicate with each other, understand each other, shared visions, etc., etc. So yes, it is hugely important, and that's also important for then the learning that emerges out of that experiment or project, whatever it is, because of the networks and all of those people involved. That learning then spreads far and wide, which can benefit others who haven't been necessarily directly involved, but who might be interested in trying to do similar things, maybe in different places, so they can learn from it. One of the issues with the clean development mechanism, which has been very successful in some parts of the world, China in particular, and actually very helpful in its way. I mean, it's not. I don't want to sort of denigrate the clean development mechanism, but it hasn't worked in Africa. And part of the problem is that the projects have been very tightly contained, let's say. So it has been a project developer and a financer and the companies implementing the projects which have been, the stakeholders. The wider learning and so on relevant to the technology, the skills, the knowledge, the networks have not been developed. Because that, in a sense, in China and places such as that, those already exist. Whereas in Africa, it's a very, very big place. People are very far from each other. It's much, much more difficult to establish those things. You have to work harder to do those things. And the CDM did not allow for that. That's not something that CDM would facilitate. So we need a different approach, I think, especially working in Africa. And we hope the CRIBS approach is one that can much more actively build those kinds of strengths that are needed to really make technology interventions or practice interventions actually work for the benefit of Africans. And transformative is also a very important word here, that we're talking about to some extent transforming the process of using these kinds of projects to achieve development gains.
Talking about process, you speak passionately about the systems and the subsystems when you're talking about the CRIBS processes. Tell us the importance of this systems approach in ensuring that the stakeholders and the policymakers are understanding why it's important for them to understand the whole process and how the systems enable them to visualize effective ways of engaging the GCF.
Well, I could go on for hours about systems, but I won't do that. But if you think about, you need systems just to make things work. very simple things which I'm sure everybody comes across every day, where a piece of technology breaks down, you know, your phone or your TV or whatever it is, it breaks down. What happens next? You need to get it repaired. Well, who can repair it? Well, if you haven't got effective systems, there may not be repair available locally. So then, you know, you have to send away to somebody in Japan or China or something for parts. You know, that's a long process. That's not a functioning system. You need to be able to access these things locally and quickly for things to really function well. So that's just, you know, just in the normal use and operation of things. But in terms of the systems thinking and seeing how a project might be more than simply installing I don't know, a wind turbine, or to go to one of the examples in the training, as Mildred was talking about, you know, just cleaning the existing valley tanks in the cattle corridor in Uganda. Okay, you can clean those tanks, and the tanks will work better for a while, and people will get water, but the tanks will likely silt again, and then you need to clean them again, and so on and so on. You could, you know, you can put in a system to do that, but as climate change has a much more important impact on the availability of water, then okay, the tanks might be okay, but where's the water coming from? So then you can think about, well, ways to prevent the silting, to make the tanks work better. And in her project, you know, there's regreening of the upstream areas. So that should improve the performance of the tanks. But she's also built in water efficiency ideas into her project. So it's not just about the supply of water and the operation of tanks, but it's about the sustainable supply of water and the better use of water. So it becomes an integrated project. And then looking at it in those terms, you start to realize that there are all kinds of skills and capabilities that you need to access. Not just about cleaning a tank, but also about the right kind of vegetation that you can plant in that particular area, how to take care of that. You need to experiment with water efficiency technologies, which may be quite new to that particular place. So then you need to have people who know about those technologies and are able to work with the local community. You need to engage the local community because they know their place better than anybody else. So they can tell you about the climate, they can tell you about the vegetation, they can tell you about the water availability, and so on and so on. And so as you start to look at it as a system, you see how you can engage with more and more diverse stakeholders who can bring all of these skills together in a way that hopefully will build relations which will outlast the time of the project. And that's, let's say, one of the elements of the sustainability part of this. But also those people then can go on and do other projects where they bring what they've learned from that particular project to bear on the next problem that they need to try and solve. And so you start to build a system that supports itself and becomes much, much more sustainable more widely.
Dr. Joanes, as a top scholar on climate change in Africa, and of course as a policy maker, you definitely understand the landscape of the GCF processes in East Africa. Could you briefly tell us what the situation looks like in the East African countries?
The landscape of GCF. What I would say is that the GCF landscape, GCF came in with a lot of premise for African countries, especially in East Africa. Of course, with the consideration that there has been that recognition that Africa didn't perform very well under CDM. So there has been a lot of support, a lot of expectation that the GCF would be a little bit different and would really bring some active participation by African countries. But what I would say is that the GCF process in Africa, in East Africa, or in Africa as a whole, is still evolving. There are still a lot of challenges that need to be addressed. Challenges such as the institutional processes, the institutional dynamics that these countries face to enable the GCF mechanisms to be well absorbed into the systems of these countries. So this is one of the things that I think still makes the process to be quite evolving as well. The other aspect is in terms of the capacity to be able to competitively engage with the GCF. That is also another aspect which is still evolving and still require a lot of support for the African countries. I think the expectation initially was that GCF would be a little bit simpler compared to CDM, and so participants within Africa would easily get it and go for it, get the money, write proposals and all that. But the GCF, the process is proving to be a little bit, complicated, more than what was expected. And a lot of the things, the technical design, the monitoring, the institutional layout that basically were under CDM, those are the same kind of things that are kind of coming in to the GCF in order to make it work effectively and to speak to the global goal around mitigation and adaptation. So the process is still evolving in terms of capacity as well. So there's need for capacity building among stakeholders to be able to take that actively and be able to design the proposals in competitive ways. The other thing I would mention is that the GCF process in East Africa is also one that is facing a lot of competition from different perspectives. Africa, when you look at Africa, the appropriate or the priority thing for African stakeholders, the governments and other stakeholders, is adaptation. And if you look at the GCF expectation, there's a lot of mitigation expectation in the GCF. Why is that? It's because a lot of the money that come into the GCF are investment monies, some of which are from private entities, and the private entities would expect some quantify returns on adaptation, and so it's very difficult to sell. Still difficult. It's possible, but it's still difficult to sell adaptation to actions to the private sector. It's easy to sell the mitigation options because then you are able to show that you've been able to sequester a particular amount of carbon, and then there is some monetary value attached to that. So that is quite sellable to the private sector. Now the dilemma comes in East Africa in the sense that our priorities are more in adaptation and less in mitigation. So trying to balance the two kind of expectations, I think is quite some bringing some sort of a challenge to the African GCF landscape. And I think it's one of the things that through the training such as the one we've had using the CRIBS approach is one of the things that we can try to harmonize. How can we enable our governments? How can we enable stakeholders interested in the GCF process? How can we enhance their capability to be able to bring out the elements of mitigation in their initiatives, even as we sort of acknowledge that adaptation is very important. So the competition between mitigation and adaptation and the interest around that is also something which is kind of a challenge to the GCF landscape. But most importantly, which I think is something that I've already mentioned, the institutional interplay, in the GCF process is quite a major challenge within the African system. Because GCF comes from a global institutional architecture, with the global players and global standardized forms of doing things. But it's coming on top of established system. These countries where GCF is expected to work are basically having their institutional designs. They have their national institutional arrangements and all that. So we are seeing a situation where we are having two layers of institutional processes. So how to make the two layers coherent in a manner that enhances effectiveness of the GCF process, I think is a major challenge in Africa at the moment. And I think one of the most important things the GCF board should really be quite aware of, or should really seek to understand a lot more to make the GCF work quite effective, is the institutional interplays, the political economy of the climate financing landscape. We have problems and we have issues around institutional competitions where, this ministry is competing with that sector. This ministry wants to host the climate change fund. The other one also wants to host it. So there's a lot of conflicts in the process, and all these conflicts at the end of the day affects the effectiveness of the process. So for the GCF board and the international community, it would be useful to really understand that political economy of the process. And I think also through the CRIBS, the innovation that we are bringing in through the CRIBS approach, it is possible that we start bringing out some of these challenges so to the knowledge of the GCF board and other financiers.
We had CRIBS 1, CRIBS 2, and now we have CRIBS 3. Could you please tell us a bit more what CRIBS 1 achieved, CRIBS 2, and what you intend to achieve with CRIBS 3?
Yeah, thank you. CRIBS 1 was mainly introducing the idea of CRIBS to policymakers across the East African region. So we had almost, I think, it happened in 2016, and we had almost more than 30 policymakers drawn from the different countries, and the idea was to, tell them and create awareness about this particular tool called CRIBS, which could enable them to think innovatively and put in place much more effective proposals and climate change programs. And then CRIBS 2 then built on that, now not just about awareness, but trying to link the CRIBS as an approach to the international climate change financing, and looking at opportunities which CRIBS present to these countries in terms of enabling them to access the international funding. So, we tried to engage also quite a big group of policymakers drawn from all over East Africa around that, so that they could, see what are how best, CRIBS could be used to access climate change financing, and that includes aspects to do with, opportunities around competitive proposal development, opportunities around networks that CRIBS can create to be able to, form formidable teams in accessing these funds, opportunities around building national innovation systems, which are quite critical in terms of what Dr. Roba said, incubating technologies. National innovation systems are quite critical, because if you have technologies which are, just come into place without systems to ensure that they are working and they're effective and they're meeting the goals for which they were designed, then you realize that those such technologies can fail. But when we have a good national innovation system which enables capabilities to come out, enables the interconnections between the different sectors, and so we stop this thing around people working in silos and doing their own things and all that. I think it's a very a useful opportunity that CRIBS bring in the process. So all that basically were meant to show how we can be able to use the tool to access international climate financing. Now CRIBS 3, which we have just concluded, was now a bit focused. Now we mainly focused it into more practical things. So that's why we got a very targeted group of policymakers who we also call champions, because they're champions in the sense that when they go back to their different institutions, they're able to cascade the knowledge that they've got from the training to other to the other colleagues, other departments, wherever they work. So the idea was to use this targeted approach with a targeted group to try and practicalize CRIBS in terms of developing GCF proposals, and I think it has come on well, and it's been quite transformative, because the kind of concepts and proposals that we are seeing now that has gone through the CRIBS grilling are really something to admire and to look up to.
And looks like some people are actually noticing what CRIBS is doing. And towards the end of August, you will be in Abuja, Nigeria. The African Union has called for a high-level meeting to try and see how CRIBS can be incorporated into the NDAs of the various the regional blocks in Africa. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, of course, this is very important, and this is a very big engagement for us, because we've been doing the GCF trainings through the CRIBS approach, and of course through other innovative approaches. And what we realized, or what we've noted, is that not so many platforms exist to do this. So this is one of the main, or one of the most tested, platforms or ways of doing trainings on GCF, going from just selling the idea, thinking about the idea into now what we are having today in terms of developing the proposals. Now, because of that, I think the lessons that we've been drawing from CRIBS 1, CRIBS 2, and now the ones that we have for CRIBS 3, these lessons have been well received outside there, both in terms of the people who attend these trainings. They're able to talk positively about them. They're able to really use them quite effectively. And so whenever stakeholders look at Africa, where do we see opportunities for a more effective training, more effective GCF support system? So what we are beginning to see is that we are being, through this process, the CRIBS process, the GCF training that we've been undertaking, is being recognized as one of the main platforms that can support the African systems to be competitive in terms of GCF. And not only the stakeholders involved in the process, but top policymakers. So when we talk about the African Union, this is the topmost political body in Africa. I mean, making a lot of political institutional decisions when it comes to issues of sustainable development, issues of climate change. We have the Agenda 2063, which has been coined by the African Union, and all African governments are now trying to align their work with that. So it is a powerful policy body and a powerful policy platform. And what we can see now is that through their passion to raise capability of African countries, they've recognized the trainings we've been doing under CRIBS, and now they have invited us to partner with them in delivering a similar training, but more focused on the nationally designated authorities, the focal points for different African countries who are responsible for GCF. So they will all converge in Abuja sometime at the end of August, and through this kind of training of CRIBS and all that, we'll be there to partner in terms of enhancing their skills, of talking to them about CRIBS and how they can be able to really manage the GCF processes at the national level in a more competitive and transformative manner. And to us, I think this is very big, because it's going to then give us the next springboard to design a much more bigger program that is going to be sustainable and systematic in terms of addressing capacity challenges in Africa in the context of climate change.
Everyone is talking about CRIBS. Even the GCF board is talking about CRIBS. It's recognized by the GCF board. Could you briefly tell us a bit about this?
Probably not, actually. Sorry.
We don't have any information about it.
Not really. No, because I wasn't directly involved in that. So
okay.
Yeah.
All right. But anyway, the 2 weeks training at Elementaita Country Lodge here in Kenya was meant to empower and engage policymakers in East Africa to engage on the GCF processes. How will you say the training has been? How will you gauge it?
Well, actually, as Dr. Joanes said earlier, it was learning for everybody. I think this is the first time we've tried to do this very practically focused training. The previous 2 CRIBS meetings were much shorter, day and a half, 2 days. This was 2 weeks. So a lot of challenges with that. First of all, just getting 5 people here who are normally very busy away from their desks for 2 weeks is quite a challenge. So we succeeded on that front. But to translate the findings from research into practical guidance is also a challenge. I think we have, because we can see now, 5 very interesting concept notes, I think we can sort of pat ourselves on the back and say that we have, to some extent, achieved that translation into practical guidance, and the participants seem very enthused about the idea of CRIBS. So again, that's a very good sign. But having said all that, I think there's a lot we still need to learn about how to do this, as effectively as possible. So that's something we need to reflect upon, perhaps quite urgently before the the Abuja meeting. But I think we can be pleased. I think that actually this approach, this CRIBS approach, does seem to have a real resonance for those who are trying to get funding from the GCF to implement projects, adaptation, mitigation, whichever the focus is or wherever the focus is, to achieve really strong sustainable development gains in their countries. So there is what I've, if you like, discovered, or what I take away from this, is we have hit on something that has a huge, to borrow Dr. Joanes' word again, transformative potential. Yes, we've still got work to do. I think we can develop things further, and we'll reflect on how to do that. But I think we've taken a very big step in a very important direction. I certainly look forward to opportunities to do more with it. The Abuja meeting is a very exciting opportunity, and I hope it's a challenge we can meet.
Well, there was a lot of talk from the policymakers about how their capabilities have been enhanced on the clean energy access, on the renewable energy proposals, and very insightful information on how they decided on the projects that they are currently working on. What would be your take on this? Do you think the policymakers have the objectives of the meeting has been met, and because there's a lot of positive talk about how they will go back and change some of these issues that the countries have faced in terms of accessing the GCF fund. What are your views on this?
Well, from judging by the way they have all the participants have engaged in what is really quite a tough process, I think, to do in 2 weeks. They've given it a huge amount of energy themselves, and focus and concentration, and work very hard. And I think in that process, it's kind of obvious to us, looking at them, that actually, yes, that's a fair reflection. They have built their capabilities for thinking very differently about projects. That yes, you still look to implement a project, but how can you maximize the benefits or design that project in much more systemic ways, and maximize the benefits, the opportunities that might arise from those projects. So I think they are, as far as I can tell, they are going away with their own enhanced capabilities, and we will continue to engage with them as they sort of finalize the concepts. They're very close to that point, I think, but we certainly want to engage, make sure they've got everything possible out of this, even beyond the training, and then to engage with them beyond that as they become the champions, the CRIB champions in their institutions, and that we work together as a network to facilitate much more development of perhaps even new concepts and so on, and really see this process through for the long term, and learning from that, if you like, living the ideas of the CRIBS goals within this at present. So there are several things to try and figure out what kinds of ways could we monitor that, learn from that, encourage things where perhaps they're not working as we'd hoped. So there's actually quite a lot of work to do in that part of it, which is still to come. But then some of it we will probably have to, let's say, learn from the experience in order to design the right kinds of indicators that help us actually make the things work better, rather than sort of decide on all of them at the start, although the number of proposals funded would be a good start, yeah.
I think I'd like to pass the question to Dr. Joanes again. How would you rate the success of CRIBS in 1 year's time or 2 years' time? What will be your indicators? What are your thoughts on this?
For me, the idea behind CRIBS is to, and I continue to emphasize this, is to bring out competitive and transformative ideas, proposals, and projects. When you talk about transformative and competitive proposals, or projects, they are projects which are able to attract funding. So one of the things that I would look forward to is the possibility, how much the CRIBS process has been able to support competitive proposals which are being considered for funding. And one of the ways we're going to do that is through the process that we're already beginning now, because we are now having the CRIBS champions in the different countries which have been represented here. So we will continue to work with them and continue to refine the ideas that they have, make them competitive and design them into competitive proposals, which then are going to be submitted to donors. They can be the GCF, it can be the GCF board, it can be other donors. So depending on that, one of the things we'll be looking at is how many of these ideas are considered for funding. But also, as Dr. Rob says, I think we're also looking at a much broader system-wide outcomes in terms of the ability of these champions and the people we work with, the stakeholders we've engaged with in the CRIBS process, to go back to their different institutions and be able to sort of trigger a coordinated approach and a much more sort of transformative learning towards doing things, especially in the context of climate change.
One of the highlights for the training was to ensure that policymakers consistently communicate and collaborate amongst themselves and also in their countries. We spoke about institutionalizing CRIBS in the various countries that the policymakers who've been engaged in the training processes should be able to do. So what's the best way that the policymakers should do? What are the effective ways of institutionalizing CRIBS in their countries and organizations at home?
I think I'll leave that question to the country champions, because they understand the systems better and the context within which they are working. They understand that better, and they know the best opportunities and spaces to really push for the idea in terms of making it part of the institutional mandates. But more generally, I'll just mention that I think the overarching thing would be the process to be owned, and they are supposed to, the institutions that are taking it up are supposed to see its value. I mean, countries are supposed to see the value of CRIBS, and I think that is one of the tasks that Dr. Rob, myself, and many other experts working in this field have, to be able to continue showing the value of this tool in terms of enhancing the effectiveness, the planning, the proposal, the project development, and attraction of funding for different government programs. So I think that is one thing that we will continue to look through in the process. But most of how it's gonna happen, I think we are allowing the champions to really take it up and to use it, and then we'll come in strategically to support the process in a manner that makes it quite well embedded and owned in their systems.
It has been 2 weeks of GCF and CRIBS and a lot of climate financing and engagement. Any parting shots on CRIBS and GCF?
Well, I should say thank you to everyone who's been involved. Everyone who's been involved, including yourself and everybody organising this. It's been very intense work, but quite often with intense work, you've come out at the other end and you think that was really worth the effort, and this has been really worth the effort. And I've been, I think we've also had quite a lot of fun along the way, so which is, that's always nice. But basically, yeah, it's been a great experience personally for me. It's always important for the likes of me as an academic to get out of the office and into what we call the field, and actually meet people who are trying to do stuff in practice, and to be reminded of the challenges they face, and thinking how does all that academic knowledge, research, whatever, provide a basis for helping people to actually achieve these kinds of practical and important sort of challenges, to meet those challenges. So this kind of engagement is really important on a personal level for thinking about that sort of translation from academia onwards, but also learning back then to the way I can practice my sort of academic career, as it were, or my academic life. So yeah, there's a lot to take out of this kind of process, and it's been a good one.
Thank you very much. Dr. Joanes, parting shot on CRIBS and GCF.
Let's work together to make GCF a success in Africa. If we fail, I think Africa will not have any reason to talk about climate change. To make it work, we have to work together. We have to continue having innovative partnerships, innovative platforms, and engagement opportunities that enables different components, or different actors and stakeholders to bring in their capabilities in making Africa a better place through the GCF process.
Thank you very much. That was an insightful discussion on the CRIBS mechanism and GCF processes. It's been an intense 2 weeks here at the Elementaita Country Lodge, and we are grateful that we could be able to have some of the top scholars and policymakers from Africa and the world to speak to us about the climate financing for African countries. Thank you very much, Dr. Joanes, and thank you very much, Dr. Rob.
Thank you.